So let's talk. So this, of course, segues nicely from church teaching, because the whole point, again, the moral law is there to make us happy, right? And part of, a good marital relationship would be good, healthy expression of sexuality. And so it would actually kind of make sense, if you have the understanding that the church does about the moral life, that good sex would flow from the church's teaching. This is not obvious to the world, right? In case you haven't noticed. It's not obvious to most people in the church. So let's talk a little bit about this. I want to start a little bit, just to remember we alluded in the first, I talked a lot in the first talk about sex differences between men and women. So I want to talk just a little bit more about that and about sex differences. And of course, this is a convoluted and not well understood idea. And people seem to think that there's no difference between men and women. Casey is like, yeah, I'm with you all the way. It just so happens that not just in matters of sex, but in all kinds of ways, men and women really are different. I don't know if this fits your experience, but it fits mine. It is also true in matters pertaining to sex. So, I think, in fact, this graphic kind of nicely illustrates somewhat. As you remember from the earlier talk, with the sexual economics, men are very focused when it comes to relationships, and sex is very important to men. This is not a moral judgment, because of course sex isn't an evil thing anyway, but it has everything to do with biology as well as culture, but the culture really grows up out of the biology. This is based on the material from premarital sex in America, so this is a younger cohort, but it's probably a little more, it's probably fairly indicative of older ages too. So these are sex preferences in general. So men are more likely to initiate sex more often. Men tend to be more promiscuous. More men have more sexual partners than women do. Men refuse sex less often if it's offered. Men will rate, just in their own expression of things, will rate their sex drive as stronger than women will. Men are much more likely to use pornography, though unfortunately that gap is closing. Okay, women generally rate sex positively. It's not the case that most women rate sex negatively or something, but they are not as enthusiastic about it as men. They prefer sex in a committed relationship. Men are much less likely than women to say that they want sex within the context of a committed relationship. And as we've already talked about, women are much more likely to see sex as a means to an end than an end in itself. They are more likely to trade sex for other perceived goods. Love, affection, self-esteem. So again, relationship tends to rank very high on women's lists of perceived goods and preferences. The interesting thing is, when you look at sex in married couples, that it's not necessarily what you might expect. Okay, so first of all, who has more sex? Okay, how many people think single people have more sex than married people? How many people think married people have more sex? How many people I have no idea, and I'm not going to raise my hand. Right. Okay, so it's interesting. I've given a talk much like this, actually the first talk with this stuff thrown in, to college students, like secular college students. And of course, they all think single people have more sex, right? Because, what does the media tell you? So when you look at those things, or the responses when they're asked about marriage and why marriage is the end of their life, right? One of the things that comes up over and over and over again is that, of course, everybody knows that married couples don't have a good sex life, as opposed to single people. And so part of the allure of, staying unmarried for longer is the idea that this is where you have better sex. And in I think it was in Premarital Sex in America, the interview said, how do you know that? Like, where do you get your information? The college student was like, everybody knows that. It's like what all the movies show and why are you even asking me that question? Okay, so the mean for singles is to have sex 59 times a year. Married couples almost double it. Thank you very much. Okay, so, and people who study this kind of thing, sociologists who study this, it actually is not that hard to realize why when you think about it. If you're a single person, it's not an automatic thing unless you're cohabiting. Cohabiting couples are the only couples who come close, though they still don't equal married couples. If you're not cohabiting, it's kind of a lot of work to find somebody to have sex with. And there might be all kinds of things involved, like courtship, or, these buying them drinks, or, paying them compliments, and, it's not just an automatic thing, right? And, okay, so what's the situation with married couples? They've done all that already, right? Hopefully they're still doing it, the compliments and the courtship and all that, but, they've already done all of that. Again, it's not nearly as much of a negotiating thing, where, it's like, well, is she somebody who might want to have sex with me? You already know that she is. She married you, right? So it's just much less complicated for married couples. But, the undergraduates in my audience say, we all know that single people have better sex, right? And it's interesting, all the stuff with men and women, which we'll look at, all of men's, if you look at big cohorts, right, their expressed sexual preferences are for things that are not essentially married sex, multiple sexual partners and that kind of thing. You see that a lot more among men than among women. So, 31% of single women say that sex, when they're single, is extremely emotionally and physically satisfying. Okay? And among men, 37% say that. Okay, so let's look at married women. 42% of women say that sex is extremely emotionally and physically satisfying. And what about men? 50% of men. Okay, I think this is very interesting because all these expressed sexual preferences that men claim to have, especially in their 20s, seem to mitigate against enjoying married sexuality. But in fact, men find, when they get married, that it's not the end of their sexual life, it's actually the beginning of the best sexual life that they've had. And so this is just kind of across the board, these kinds of numbers. All right, so as sociologists say, married sex really is better sex. Over the long run, there is no better strategy for achieving great sex than binding oneself to an equally committed mate. Again, if you're talking about the single world, you're not necessarily, especially the hookup culture, but even, more, less kind of dramatic promiscuity or something, you're not necessarily interacting with a person who has your best interests in mind. If you're talking about simply the pursuit of pleasure, and you're both trying to kind of maximize your own pleasure, that's not a recipe for the other person being satisfied, right? Because the other person's not even really on the radar, and that's especially true, I think, with these hookup kinds of relationships. Whereas in the married context, you've got committed people who really love each other, or are, trying to love each other better, right? Who care about the other person. And also, that not only is this person your sexual partner tonight, this person is your sexual partner tomorrow night, and next year, and 5 years from now. You're really incentivized, right, to figure out how to make this a mutually enjoyable experience, as opposed to somebody who's picked up somebody in a bar and may or may not see them ever again, right? The incentivization is much lower. So it just kind of makes sense on a purely natural level. All of those strings, we talked about the sexual revolution being in favor of no strings attached sex. It is very clear, especially for women, that when women look at sex, it's the strings that make sex good. They don't want no strings attached sex. The strings are the part they want. The commitment, the love, the affection, the he'll call me tomorrow, right? That's what they want. And so where do you find strings, right? Where do you find commitment? Well, you find it in marriage. So I love it. Sometimes sociology is what I call the quantification of the blindingly obvious. That's what somebody actually did a study that indicated that selflessness is better than selfishness. Selflessness establishes a circle in which psychological activity favors stable and authentic happiness. There's a wonderful sociologist, Brad Wilcox, who works on the Marriage Project at the University of Virginia, who came out with similar data. The happiest married couples are the couples who rate highest on selflessness measures, right? As opposed to people who rate high on selfish measures, those tend to be the most unhappy married couples. Which, again, our culture doesn't prize selflessness, right? Selflessness is the ticket to not being happy, right? Selflessness is the ticket to being a doormat, to not pursuing pleasure, to not getting the stuff you need. But in fact, it doesn't work that way at all. The happiest people are the people, married people score highest in happiness measures in general over any other cohort. The happiest people in our society are married couples who are living selflessly. Well, doesn't that make sense though? Like, think of the best people that you know to interact with in general. Think of the best coworkers, the best bosses, the best friends, as well as, the best people to make a spouse. They're the people who aren't selfish, right? Those are the people you want to be around. And think, in general, the people who are selfish people generally very happy in their experience? Not in my experience, right? Selfishness is not the ticket to human happiness. And we're actually getting quantifiable data that affirms that, in fact, the more selflessly you live, the more likely you are to be a truly happy and fulfilled person. Which is interesting, of course, when we talk more about things like natural family planning, right? So if you want a happy marriage, if you want good sex, then what you want to do from a purely selfish perspective is to foster selflessness, right? Selflessness is what actually leads to higher happiness and to healthier sexuality. Why? Because there's child number 6. Isn't she cute? Why? Because self-gift is actually freeing. There's kind of a this bias against the idea that freedom means getting as much stuff for myself as I can. Remember that idea of freedom as lots and lots of choices. But what actually frees us is not being tied to lots and lots of stuff. I lived for about 6 months with the Missionaries of Charity, the Mother Teresa sisters, in saris and stuff, and these were hands down the freest women I've ever met in my life. They would get a letter at that point, typed on a manual typewriter with the paper cut out from the bottom of another piece of paper that wasn't used, right? That's how they lived. They get a letter saying, you're being transferred from Harlem to Nicaragua in 2 days. They would pack up their little shoebox of belongings and go. They were so free to be responsive to God's will. They weren't held captive by too much stuff, by their own pride, by no, I'm involved in something very important right here, right now. These are very free women because they were so selfless. The selfishness is what makes us unfree. If you think of people, you might have the misfortune to know people who are in addictive patternings, alcohol or drug addiction, or you might have experienced that in your own life. That's not freedom. That's slavery, right? But that's what all sin is. It binds us to these patterns of living, and it keeps us from being free to respond to God's grace. So what is the answer? There was a great article in the New York Times, I think it was last Sunday, who argues that this idea, if it feels good, do it. He says, unless you share the same existential goals as protozoa, this is often flat out wrong. And his whole point is, if you look at the difference between humans and, lower biological forms, what really makes humans happy is that we don't just operate on scratching the next itch. We're able to step back and have bigger goals and defer gratification. And so he says, what really makes us happy is loving people, not pleasure. Loving people, not things, which of course Mother Teresa is a beautiful example of. There's child number 3. And so to get back to the theology of the body, what John Paul II calls the spousal meaning of the body, he gets this idea from Gaudium et Spes, which Monsignor read at the very beginning of the day. The fact that we're made for a sincere gift of ourselves, and we only find ourselves in giving ourselves away. It is just simply a truth that's confirmed over and over again by our human experience, that is when we truly find fulfillment. There's child 4 and 5. 4 has the biggest eyes ever. When he was a newborn, the midwife brought him in and said, "Oh, he's so beautiful." And my husband and I were like, "Wow, they really say that to everybody." That child looked so weird because he was all eye, It was like, whoa. Now he's very handsome. But as it says, as JP2 said in Mulieris Dignitatem on the dignity and vocation of women, for no human being, male or female, created in the image and likeness of God, can in any way attain fulfillment apart from this image and likeness. God made us as the image of himself. But God's a giver, right? God is not selfish. God doesn't hold things in, hoard them to himself. And so if we want to really live the way we're meant to live, we've got to live in his image. We've got to fulfill that image in us and give of ourselves. So that gets us back to this fundamental question of fear versus trust. A lot, when we act selfishly, we kind of grasp at things and hold things in, refuse to kind of branch out and be courageous and give. It's often just because we're just really afraid. Am I really going to be happy if I don't watch out for myself? Is anybody going to? Am I going to be taken care of? We just have all of these kind of really primal fears that come up with this issue of contraception. So a couple kind of practical things, and I talk about these in my book too. What are some ways we can further trust, that we can build the trust muscle, strengthen that trust muscle in ourselves? So the first thing I say is give up, by which I mean we have to practice every day this fundamental Christian calling that we've been given of recognizing that God is in charge and not me. And that means in little things and big things. It means in our fertility, and it means in our finances, and it means in how I'm going to plan out my day, and as well as what job am I going to pick and what spouse am I going to marry. We have to have a fundamental commitment to the idea that God really loves me. And therefore, he really has my back, right? I might not get why he wants me to do X, Y, or Z. But if he wants me to do X, Y, or Z, it's got to be what's best for me because he really loves me. And that is a matter of faith. And that's a matter of, ideally experiencing that in our families of origin. But if we haven't, and so many people are really broken in that regard, that we have to ask God to heal us and show us that love, that we can really trust in his love. And that starts with us. When we in the pews can start to trust radically, other people will notice. So how can I really give up my life to God? How do we do that? Well, prayer, because we can't ask God to love us and be receptive to that love if we're not communicating with him. So a strong, healthy life of private prayer. But then also receiving the graces that are there in the sacraments. We have this grace of baptism that's already been given us, that's made us a priest, prophet, and king in God's church, right? We have the grace of the Eucharist feeding us. We have the grace of confession, healing all of these sinful issues and patterns in our life. We have, for those of us who are married, we have the grace of matrimony to draw on very directly when marriage is hard, and marriage after the fall is going to be hard, at least occasionally, right? And so we have the graces of that sacrament to draw on. I always suggest to people, it's really helpful to start with money. I think finances and fertility are very, very closely connected because they're both about the future. And they're both about fearing, am I going to be okay tomorrow, 5 years from now, 30 years from now? They're both about that kind of primal control over our own lives. And so a very helpful guide point, and I get this from Janet Smith, a very helpful guideline is to start by tithing. And classically, by classically I mean since the Old Testament, there's been, the recommendation is 10% of our income. And as the pastor in The Simpsons said once, that's gross, people, not net. But But, however you choose to give your money to charities, as well as to the church, to Marika's office. We can provide you with a list if you need. But, to be generous, to trust that God's going to take care of us. And it is hard, I know, because I manage our family finances. And it is hard to trust. But to start to do that, God is really funny. You guys know that gospel story where they have to pay the temple tax? Peter comes to Jesus and says, we have to pay the temple tax. Anybody remember what Jesus says to do? Go catch a fish. Oh, thanks, Jesus. That's obvious. Okay, I'll go catch a fish. And what's in the fish? A coin, a gold coin that pays the temple tax, right? I think this is God's way of saying, money is easy for me. I can conjure it into a fish's mouth if I need to, okay? God, really, money is not hard for me, says God. And I have had experiences where I'm like, our bank account has more money in it than it's supposed to. Like I've literally had these experiences where I've been like, no, really, we're supposed to have less money than is showing up in our bank account right now. I mean, God really can do that, So we have to trust. I mean, clearly it helps if we're not compulsive spenders. We've got a part to play in all this and everything, but it's a good place to start, trusting God with our money. And then evangelizing, to work to spread the good news. And I think a lot of us, and a lot of people you'll encounter are on board and want to pass on the good news about this stuff, but they feel like hypocrites because of their own past and the choices that they've made. And it's really important to reassure those people that, okay, so you're a divorced woman, you can still express the truth of God, about these issues. None of us have to be perfect first before we pass on the good news. And this is, when you teach something, you really learn it. I know this as a teacher. So if you're teaching these truths, they get into you in a way that they won't if you're just kind of mulling over them in the silence and quiet of your room, So I do encourage you to think about ways concretely that you can pass this on. I'm sure that Angelo and Suzanne and Marika have plenty of concrete ways for you to do it, but even just in your personal relationships, to more and more be willing to speak the truth. It's hard for Catholics to talk about the faith. It is, I'm a cradle Catholic. I had an experience, I take the bus a lot in Boston. All kinds of people take the bus in Boston, so you meet all kinds of different people on the bus. And I happened to have one of my many children once on the bus with me. Believe me, if I take the bus with all 6 children in Boston, boy, is it an evangelical opportunity. People talk to you. Sometimes they say things you can't believe that they have the gall to say. But lots of evangelical opportunities. I once had one of my kiddies, and there was a 20-something guy there. And he was like, oh, my girlfriend is pregnant. Said, I am just so excited. She's going to have this baby in like a month, and I've been going to prenatal classes, and and he saw this baby, and he was just like, oh, baby's coming, you could tell. And we talked for a little bit, and I was like, get out in 2 minutes, and so we chatted for a bit and everything, and I said, you know what, you should think about marrying her. And I tried to, we had established a rapport, and I was never going to see this guy again, so, what did I have to lose? To actually say something instead of just biting my lip and saying a prayer, which, I also prayed for him, but, to say something, it's funny because when I said that, he's like, I've been thinking about that. I think I might. But you just never know what God might be calling you to do. And so to just kind of ask, I know somebody who every day prays for the courage to share the faith with somebody that day. He says, send me somebody in my life to whom I can share the faith with today, which is a really bold prayer, I think. So to have that boldness, I think, is very important. I'm going to talk briefly about NFP. I'm not the expert in the room on NFP, but just in case, some of you maybe know some of this, but to make sure everybody knows all of it. NFP is not rhythm, right? The rhythm method. I would like to say the rhythm method gets a bad rap. Because if you look at the rhythm method compared to like the pregnancy prevention rate of condoms, rhythm is really close, okay? So like, I'm just gonna throw that out there because condoms really stink when it comes to pregnancy prevention. All right, it's not rhythm, because what rhythm says is, here's a calendar, and if date number 1 is the date when you first start to menstruate, then we're gonna figure 2 weeks later or whatever, you're gonna be fertile. And so it's called the calendar method. It works great if you have a regular 28-day cycle. The problem is nobody, almost nobody has a regular 28-day cycle. And so, it's kind of too one-size-fits-all. What NFP is using signs of fertility that day. A lot of people tell me, I have an irregular cycle, I don't think NFP can work. I'm like, no, NFP works perfectly for you. What does not work is rhythm. But NFP actually works perfectly if you have an irregular cycle. Why? Because it says, am I fertile today? That's what NFP does by looking at the signs of fertility today. It is very effective if it's practiced, if you use one of the modern methods of NFP and you really do it and learn, go to class and learn how to do it. The success rate is 99% in preventing pregnancy, which is comparable to the pill and the most kind of effective methods of contraception. I want to emphasize, NFP is not Catholic birth control. NFP is also not, quote unquote, the method of birth control that the church says is okay, end quote. I get this a lot when I grade student papers and so forth. Why do we think NFP and contraception are the same thing? Or why would people fall into thinking that? Okay, there's the same intention, which is I want to avoid pregnancy. And so a lot of people will very honestly be confused and say, why, if NFP is okay, isn't contraception okay? Because the intention is the same. Okay, so the intention, we got the intention to avoid pregnancy. The thing is, any action that you take, any moral action, is more than just what I say, what goes on in between your ears, which is your intention. Because you can have an intention, that's one part, but then you have what you do with the intention, which in technical theological language is called the object of the act. What am I doing? Okay, so I always give the example, I have a good intention, which is to financially support my family. Good intention, church says. Stamp of approval. Awesome. Support your family. Okay, so what do I do with that? Do I rob the Quickie Mart? Or do I get a job? If intention is the only thing that matters, it doesn't matter what I do with the act, with that intention. It's equally good. Well, when you say, no, whoa. Get the job, do not rob the Quickie Mart. Robbing the Quickie Mart is not okay. Okay, so the intention has to be good, but then what we do with the intention also has to be good. What do you do with with contraception? What's the action that you do? What's the act of contracepting? Okay, so say with hormonal contraception, you deliberately impede the fertile processes of your body. Okay, what's a definition we can find that covers all forms of contraception? What are you doing in the act of contraception?
Suppress.
Deliberately suppressing or interfering with the procreative aspect of a sexual act, right? Whether it's suppressing or blocking with barrier methods or whatever. Okay. What are you doing in natural family planning?
Just avoiding the time when you're fertile.
Good. So the action for natural family planning is the action of abstinence, okay, which is avoiding intercourse, and if you're trying to avoid pregnancy, during the fertile time. Okay. Is it a morally acceptable action to not have sex? Yes, as Christopher West says, we're doing it right now. It is morally okay not to have sex, right? When you get married, the church does not say, sign the contract here that every time the wife is fertile, you must have sex. That is not the case. It is perfectly morally acceptable to engage in periodic continence, is what is called, periodic abstinence from sex. Okay, so in other words, it's a different kind of act. And the reason we know it's a different kind of act, Janet Smith says, anytime people come and keep pushing and pushing, saying, no, they're the same thing, she's like, okay, well, they're the same thing, then practice NFP, you won't notice a difference. And people are like, wait, they're totally different. Why? Because NFP asks you to not have sex for some part of the time of the month. And that's what makes the act different. But it's also what makes the act such a good thing for marriages. Because as we looked at a while ago, selflessness is good for marriage. And to say, for a husband to say to his wife, because, for health reasons, or because of the, the financial state of our family right now, or because you just are like way overwhelmed with, little kids and can't handle another pregnancy right now, we are going to abstain from this act for, a period of, what's the average abstinence period? You guys know the average?
7 to 10.
7 to 10 days, yeah, that's what I was going to say. So for 7 to 10 days, that's a selfless act to abstain. Well, it turns out that's good for marriage. It's actually good. And what we know, people can have, proper concerns that, it's good, sexual intercourse is also good for marriage. But what we know is, in fact, that NFP couples don't have any less sex than contracepting couples. It's just timed differently. In fact, they tend to generally have more sex, is what the data that I've seen shows. So it's just that they do this selfless act for good reasons for the marriage. That's actually very, very good for the marriage. It's one of the reasons why the divorce rate is so low with NFP couples. Okay, so that's just a very kind of cursory introduction of sort of the facets of this topic of healthy sexuality, holy sex, within Christian marriage. But why, the church really is making the case that not only is this the quote-unquote moral way to live, when we say it's the moral way to live, that means this is the happy way to live. It's not necessarily the easiest in the sort of superficial way. It will involve sacrifice. But you're not going to be happy as a human being unless you sacrifice. It is not possible. And again, sociology is finally catching up with this, that sacrifice and selflessness is good for you as a person and good for the couple. So our purpose in life should not be to avoid sacrifice. Our purpose should be to become the kind of people God wants us to be, which means really happy, healthy, whole human beings. So Mary is really the quintessential example of this as the mother of the Holy Family. So I always like to end my talks with Mary sort of front and center and asking for her intercession on us as individuals, on the church here in the Diocese of Ogdensburg, on the universal church, on especially those societies, namely our modern Western societies that are really torn apart by these kinds of issues and the sort of sorrows that they bring. So we ask Mary to pray for us, but we also remember that Mary is a real sign of hope. Mary is a real sign of the kind of things that God wants to do. Mary is crowned Queen of Heaven and Earth. I mean, she's the Queen of the angels. That's like amazing. Mary is like the human person. Jesus isn't a human person. That's another talk. Mary is the human person who is the most elevated. Jesus is fully human. He's just not a human person. He's a divine person. But God looks at Mary and says, this is what I want to do for humanity. I want humanity to be raised to this dignity and holiness and happiness. And so we kind of keep her in mind as we face these very difficult issues, that God really is on our side and Jesus really has won. And so we can take great solace and hope and energy and strength from that knowledge. So thank you guys very much. This has been awesome for me to give, and I hope you've enjoyed it. And I'd be happy to take any questions.